There was a time buried so deep in the memory of the world that even ancient civilizations spoke of it only in fragments, in whispers, in myths that carried the unmistakable weight of true terror. A time before the great waters came, a time before the sky broke open and the earth remembered it had once been covered by the deep. It was an age that left no architecture standing, no inscription legible, no artifact untouched by catastrophe. And yet, in the oldest texts humanity has ever possessed, the echoes of that age remain. They do not speak of paradise. They do not speak of innocence. They speak of something far darker. They speak of a world so thoroughly consumed by its own corruption that the only response left was erasure. To understand why divine judgment fell upon the ancient world before the flood, one must be willing to descend into that darkness, to look without flinching at what that civilization had become, to ask not only what happened, but why the waters came, why the skies opened, why an entire age of human existence was swallowed whole. The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It begins long before the rain, long before the first cloud gathered on the horizon. It begins with a transgression so profound, so cosmically disturbing that the world it produced could not be permitted to continue. The ancient texts of the Hebrew tradition, preserved through centuries of oral transmission before they were ever set down in written form, describe the world before the flood in terms that resist easy interpretation. Among the most unsettling of all the figures that appear in those pages are the ones called the Nephilim. The word itself comes weighted with ambiguity and dread. It derives from a root that carries the sense of falling, of those who have fallen, or perhaps of those who cause others to fall. Later traditions would translate it as giants, but the word giant, in its modern sense, fails to capture the full dimension of what ancient sources understood these beings to be. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, the description is brief but devastating in its implications. The sons of God looked upon the daughters of men, and they found them beautiful, and they took them as wives. From this union came the Nephilim, described as mighty ones, as men of renown. The text does not dwell, it does not explain, it moves quickly, as though the memory is too heavy to hold for long. But the traditions that surround that passage, preserved in texts like the Book of Enoch, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Jewish apocalyptic literature, are not so reticent. They fill in what the canonical text leaves shadowed, and what they describe is the portrait of a world in the process of being destroyed from within. According to the tradition carried in the Book of Enoch, a group of celestial beings called Watchers descended from their realm and bound themselves to the physical world through their desire for human women. The leader of this descent was named Semyaza. 200 of these beings are said to have made a pact among themselves, swearing an oath that none would turn back from what they had decided to do. They came down upon the peak of a mountain called Hermon, a name that in its own etymology carries the sense of a curse, be of something consecrated to destruction. And there, on that mountain, the great contamination began. The children born from the union of the Watchers and human women were not ordinary. They grew to enormous stature. Their appetites exceeded what the world could provide. The texts describe them consuming the food of humanity until there was none left, and then turning to consume humanity itself. They drank blood. They turned against the natural order in ways that the ancient writers clearly struggled to describe with adequate horror. But the physical corruption they embodied was only one dimension of the catastrophe they represented. The Watchers who sired them had also brought with them knowledge that was never meant to descend into the human world. Forbidden arts, the secrets of metalworking for weapons of war, the arts of enchantment and sorcery, the knowledge of how to read the movements of celestial bodies for dark purposes, the preparation of medicines that could be used to poison, the crafting of instruments that amplified human vanity and desire. Azazel, one of the most prominent among the Watchers, is credited in the Enochic tradition with teaching men how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught women how to adorn themselves, how to use cosmetics and ornaments, and the art of seduction. The transmission of this knowledge is portrayed not as a gift, but as a wound inflicted on the human race, because the knowledge arrived without the moral framework capable of containing it. It arrived in a world that was already susceptible to corruption, and it accelerated that corruption with catastrophic speed. Violence became the language of the age. The word that the Hebrew text uses to describe the condition of the pre-flood world is Hamas, a word that means violence in the most comprehensive sense, not merely physical brutality, though that was certainly present. It encompasses injustice, wrongdoing, the violation of what is right, the crushing of what is weak by what is strong. The earth, according to the text, was filled with this violence, not scattered, not occasional, filled from edge to edge, from the highest to the lowest. The infection had reached everywhere, and the Nephilim were at the center of it. They were not simply symbols of physical power. They were the embodiment of a principle that the ancient mind understood as the gravest possible offense against the order of creation. They represented the mixing of what was meant to remain separate. The boundary between the celestial and the earthly, between the divine and the human, had been violated. And from that violation, a civilization had grown that bore the marks of that original transgression in everything it did. One must understand what corruption meant in the ancient worldview to fully grasp why judgment was not merely possible, but, in the logic of that tradition, necessary. Corruption, in its deepest sense, was not simply moral failure, it was ontological deterioration. It was the unraveling of the structure of things. When the texts say that the earth was corrupt before God, the Hebrew word used is shahat, the same word used later to describe what the flood would do to the earth. Destroy, ruin. The implication is profound. The earth was already in the process of destroying itself long before the waters arrived. The flood did not corrupt what was good. It completed what corruption had already set in motion. Human beings in that age had not merely sinned in the ordinary sense. They had fundamentally redefined what it meant to exist in relationship to the sacred. The imagination of every heart, the text says, was only evil continually, not partially, not sometimes, continually. This is not hyperbole for dramatic effect. It is a diagnosis. A civilization whose collective inner life has been oriented entirely toward what is wrong has ceased to function as civilization in any meaningful sense. It has become something else, something that reproduces only destruction, that generates only harm, that moves with increasing momentum toward its own annihilation. And the Nephilim stood as both symbol and engine of that process. Their very existence was the proof that the world had departed beyond any ordinary capacity for reform. They were not simply powerful individuals who had made bad choices. They were the living consequence of a cosmic transgression, the walking evidence that the boundary between worlds had been broken and that nothing natural could repair it. Every generation born into that world was born into a context already so saturated with corruption that genuine moral orientation had become nearly impossible to maintain. Consider what it would mean to live in that world, to grow up in an age where violence was not the exception, but the framework, where the knowledge that had been introduced into human society by the Watchers had produced a culture of domination, exploitation, and appetite, where the mighty consumed the weak without hesitation or consequence, where the sacred had been so thoroughly profaned that even the memory of what it had once meant was fading. This was not a civilization in decline. It was a civilization in disintegration. and it had been disintegrating for generations, accelerating toward a terminal point. The divine response described in the ancient text is one of the most theologically striking passages in all of sacred literature. The Creator is described as grieving. The word used carries tremendous emotional weight. It speaks of pain, of a profound inner anguish. This is not the cold pronouncement of a distant tribunal. This is the response of one who had invested meaning and purpose in what had been made, watching it unmake itself. The grief is paired with the determination that what has been created must be undone, not in anger alone, but in the recognition that continuation had become a cruelty, that allowing the world as it stood to continue was no longer an act of mercy but of complicity. But judgment did not fall immediately. This is a detail that carries its own significance. The ancient world was not destroyed in a moment of rage. There was a man named Noah, and in the midst of everything that world had become, he was described as righteous, as blameless in his generations, as one who walked with God. The existence of Noah is not simply a narrative convenience to explain how humanity survived. It is a statement about the nature of the judgment. The flood was not the destruction of all human possibility. It was the destruction of a specific civilization, a specific configuration of human society that had become irreparably hostile to life, to justice, and to the sacred order. Noah was instructed to build. In the shadow of a world consumed by destruction, one man was set to work on an act of preservation. The dimensions given for the ark are not fanciful. They are structural. They represent a vessel designed to carry weight, to displace water, to remain stable under conditions of extreme flood. The building of the ark was itself a kind of testimony, stretched across years against the world that surrounded it. Every plank of gopher wood shaped and fitted was a declaration that something was coming that the world would not survive, that the world as constituted could not be allowed to continue, and that what was worth preserving would be preserved. Meanwhile, the world continued. See, the Nephilim continued their dominion. Violence continued to fill the earth. The ancient writers do not describe any significant moment of collective awakening, no widespread repentance, no turning of the civilization away from the abyss toward which it was moving. If anything, the tradition suggests that the trajectory only steepened. A world that has committed itself to corruption does not easily reverse course. Its institutions, its power structures, its cultural inheritance, its very understanding of what constitutes power and what constitutes honor, all of it had been shaped by the long accumulation of transgression. The capacity for genuine repentance would have required dismantling nearly everything the civilization had built itself upon. And so the moment came, not quickly in the cosmic sense, not without warning. For Noah had been building his warning in wood and pitch for decades. But inevitably, as the ancient text describes it, all the fountains of the great deep were broken open, and the windows of heaven were opened. The imagery is deliberately catastrophic. This was not merely heavy rain. This was the reversal of creation itself. In the cosmology of the ancient Near East, creation had been, in part, an act of separation, of dividing the waters above from the waters below, of establishing dry land between the two. The flood was the undoing of that separation. The boundaries that creation had established were released. The world returned to the condition it had been in before structure was imposed upon it. And in that return, everything the Nephilim had built, everything the corrupted civilization had accumulated, every fortress and city and altar dedicated to the wrong powers, every monument to the violence and domination that had defined the age, all of it was swept away, not metaphorically, literally. The physical record of that civilization was erased with a thoroughness that even the most destructive forces of ordinary history rarely achieve. which is perhaps why we find so little of it. Which is perhaps why, when we look back into the deepest layers of human prehistory, we encounter a silence that no amount of archaeology has ever fully explained. The Nephilim were gone. The Watchers, according to the Enochic tradition, were bound and cast into darkness, imprisoned beneath the earth to await a final judgment, their earthly progeny swept away by the waters. The world that had formed around them, the world that had been shaped by the knowledge they brought, and the violence they cultivated, and the corruption they embodied, ceased to exist. What emerged from the waters was not the same world. It was a world that carried the memory of what had been lost, and why it had been lost, even if that memory grew dim over the long centuries that followed. What remains is the testimony, preserved in ancient texts across multiple cultures in flood narratives that span from Mesopotamia to India to the traditions of indigenous peoples across the Americas. There is the persistent echo of a world destroyed, a civilization erased, a divine response to a human catastrophe of incomprehensible scale. The details vary, the names change, the dimensions of the vessel differ, but the core of the testimony remains strikingly consistent. There was a world before this one. It was given to violence and corruption. It produced beings or conditions that violated the deepest structures of what is right. And it was ended. To ask why divine judgment fell on the world of the Nephilim before the flood is ultimately to ask what happens when the boundaries that hold civilization together are systematically dismantled, when the line between what is permitted and what is forbidden, between the sacred and the profane, between the human and whatever lies beyond it, is crossed not once in transgression but generation after generation until the crossing itself becomes the norm. The ancient answer is unsparing. What happens is that the world undoes itself, and if the world will not undo itself quickly enough, if its momentum carries it forward in destruction with sufficient force, then something from outside the world steps in to complete what the world has already begun. The rain that fell was not the beginning of the end. It was the acknowledgement of an end that had already happened. The corruption had already consumed the world from within. The Nephilim had already unmade what humanity was meant to be. The violence had already filled the earth beyond any ordinary measure. The flood was not the cause of the catastrophe. It was the response to one. And in the response, within the ark riding the surface of a drowned world, the story did not end. It began again, carrying with it the terrible knowledge of what a civilization can become when it loses its way entirely, when it forgets what it was made to be, when it chases power and appetite and forbidden knowledge past every boundary that wisdom had ever tried to set. That knowledge has never fully left us. It rides quietly beneath the surface of every age that finds itself standing at the edge of its own worst possibilities. And somewhere in the oldest memory of the human race, the sound of the waters remains, patient and waiting.